Really nice to see you. It's been a minute.
Same to you. Same to you. And hi, Dr. Yuan. Hope you're doing well.
Doing well, thank you. How are you doing? Everything okay?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I'm just at the
Awesome.
gym in between clients, so you caught me at a good time.
Awesome.
Man, you're a non-stopping working machine, Martin. Let me tell you.
I try my best.
How do you manage all that, man? It's really remarkable.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that.
Very well. So first and foremost, let me express my gratitude, Martin, because my good friend Juan and myself, well, we have bragging rights because we have the exclusive for this particularly
Yeah.
interesting and I think important study, man, because it has a lot of details that hasn't been discussed at least for now,
Mhm.
but I'm sure you're gonna discuss them with the great Revive Stronger, Steve
Yeah.
Hall. But
Yeah.
I gotta say, man, I'm gonna be all bragging all week, all month, saying I have the exclusive.
Fair enough.
So anyway,
Fair enough. I like it.
thanks, thanks for that, man. So Juan, any words?
Um, Thank you very much, Martin, because I think this is a really good opportunity to learn about your work. That I think it's very much a lot about neuromuscular fatigue and hypertrophy related to proximity failure, and I think that's really awesome work. I follow it close by, and I'm very excited. So let's chat about it.
Yeah, I'm keen. This is the first time I'm actually speaking about the study, really, or at least having conversation with someone about it online. So I'm looking forward to it.
Very well. So I think a good place to start, because both Juan and myself got some questions for you, Martin.
Mhm.
I think a good
Yep.
place to start is before your study, because studying the topic of training to failure and how to apply it to hypertrophy, we have mixed results, like your prior made analysis and the one that Zach Robinson carried out.
Mhm.
That got a little bit confusing, but we can begin by knowing the prior limitations that you took into account in your new study. So do you think we can establish what were those prior limitations in the literature, and where do you come with all the specifically your study design? Because I think that's a really great,
Mm.
good place to go after that.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, and I'll try and keep it short and sharp because I just finished writing a 60,000 word thesis on this topic, which I
Yeah.
just submitted for publication for my PhD, right? So let's try and keep it short and sharp. Well, if you've followed my work over the years, you'll notice that each of the studies I've been a part of have been coherently planned and designed to make sense over time. So it wasn't just a matter of coming up with ideas, ad hoc and running studies. Each one was planned strategically, beginning with the scoping review in 2022, I believe, where I scoped the literature, I identified the limitations in the literature, and then worked out ways in which studies could be conducted in the future to try and fill the research gaps and address the limitations. So that was the first step. From there, I was part of a meta-analysis, the initial one, like you mentioned, which I don't think the results of that analysis are completely distinct to the more recent meta regression. I think the statistical approach was a little different across the two studies, which made it tricky for some individuals to interpret. No doubt about that. The goal of that initial meta-analysis was to update the previous meta-analyses with new literature and try and move one step forward by actually considering the definition of set failure applied in the studies. Because previously, studies would just state that failure was reached, and some studies would do that better than others. What I mean by that is that some studies would explain how failure was controlled and reached, whereas others not so much. So I tried to make a distinction between the studies that do explicitly describe that momentary muscular failure was reached and those that didn't, and analyze the studies in separate themes to try and come to clearer interpretations. Now, from there, the meta regression builds on that, and instead of categorizing studies as comparing failure versus non-failure, what we did in that meta-regression was we tried to estimate, right, the RIR that was achieved in the non-failure conditions across all these studies. And one of the main limitations that I picked up in the scoping review early on was that it's very hard to actually do that because the researchers sometimes don't consider proximity to failure. Often there is no RIR prescribed. It's just a predetermined set and repetition prescription. And what we know about these set and repetition prescriptions, and even the velocity loss prescriptions that are often used in research too, what we know is that the proximity to failure reached when you terminate a set at a given point can vary across participants and across sets performed. So it's hard to estimate an RIR for one group of participants whereby the RIR can change across participants and across sets. But nonetheless, we tried to do that because that's the best we can do with the research we have. And what we found there was that as sets are terminated closer to failure, muscle hypertrophy increases. Okay, so there seems to be this relationship between estimated RIR, so not RIR in the real world, right? It's an estimated RIR value based on all these considerations I've just come up with. There seems to be a relationship between that and muscle hypertrophy. It seems to be a positive relationship, which the meta-analysis, if you look at it closely, you'll notice that the effect size, and I don't want to go too deep into statistics here, but the effect size in most cases favored train to failure. So there was always some effect there. It just wasn't large enough to be considered statistically significant or meaningful, right? So something to keep in mind there. Results of those two big analyses aren't as dissimilar as one might think. So that's where we were at. That's where we were at. And that's where we were at is that there was this positive relationship between RIR and muscle hypertrophy. And of course, in practice, there's other things we need to consider. So I was a part of a study that looked at the effects of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue. And more recently, I looked at how proximity to failure can influence muscle hypertrophy. And this is the first study to actually use RIR prescription and get participants to terminate sets at a given RIR, right, on their own volition and investigate long-term outcomes like hypertrophy. So that's where we're at now. That's how all the studies have built up to this point. And like you said, Daniel, I did try my best to design a study that fills some of the gaps we have in the literature, address some of the limitations that people often come up with, and hopefully that's going to allow for improved interpretations that can update our understanding of the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, totally, man. Like you mentioned, it's like if you follow the studies that you alluded, first, we didn't have a clear definition of what muscle failure is. That's when you came in with the momentary muscle failure definition. And then with the meta-analysis, then SAC filled some of the gaps. And now we have an RCT on the very same topic with those definitions, with that understanding. So like you mentioned, it builds up. And that's why I particularly, and I'm convinced that this is one of those really important studies for us to better understand our training and to better prescribe training for our clients. So I let my man Juan go ahead. Go ahead, brother.
Thanks, man. So proximity to failure is something I think we all underestimate a little bit, right? So when we're talking about RIR, we're talking about how close we are to reach that final repetition, or simply don't be able to still moving about concentric repetition, right? So this on a lab scenario is like pretty understanding. You know what to do, what to expect, what does it feels, right? So when you have like subjects of the study, you teach them, or you just ask them. So is there any familiarization procedure before the study, or is just like, hey, this is the problem you're going to do, this is what we expect, and let's see about it, how it goes? Or they have to learn how to this to perceive discomfort versus proximity to failure? Because I think it's very common. So something like that. How do you make that distinction?
Yeah, of course. So there was definitely a familiarization period, although all the participants in my study actually had prior experience terminating sets with RIR or RPE at some point throughout their training career. So they already had experience with the methods, the set termination method that I wanted to apply, which definitely made it a little bit easier for me. And even in practice, I wouldn't just rush someone into predicting their RIR, because I think there are boxes that need to be ticked beforehand. In the case of the study, the methods I used are the same as the ones that were used in my previous experimental study, which looked at the effect of predicting RIR, right, on the accuracy of the prediction. So I tried to use the exact same methods, and that's why if you read through the manuscript of the current study, you'll see the method section for the RIR accuracy specifically. It's quite short because I just refer you on to one of my previous studies. But basically, what I did is, I got the participants in and I briefed them about the difference between perceived discomfort and proximity to failure, which they were all already aware about, considering they had used this method in the past. And I think one of the more important aspects of my study design boils down to the RIR accuracy assessment that I conducted prior to the commencement of the intervention period. And this is the first time that this has been conducted before a long intervention study. So I did do this before my acute study looking at fatigue. I basically used the exact same methods to run it again, this time on different exercises, so the leg press and the leg extension. Basically, what I did was I took the participants through the gold standard way of estimating, or not really even estimating, but assessing, literally assessing how accurate they are with their RIR prediction. So they start a set, they call out when they perceive to have reached a certain RIR target, and they keep pushing to momentary muscular failure. So what I found after conducting all those assessments across all the participants on the leg press and the leg extension was that on average, participants were less than 1 rep away from the RIR target, which, I would deem as being, high accuracy. And that does map on to some of the findings we have in the literature currently, especially the meta-analysis by Halper et al. So that was a bit of a confidence booster for me, because although I couldn't assess the RIR accuracy of the participants throughout the study period, right, simply because the design wasn't set up like that. If you're training to RIR, it's RIR. It's not, you can't keep pushing to failure throughout the intervention period. It provided me with confidence and reassurance that, hey, these participants can actually rate their RIR pretty well, and they're likely terminating their sets within 1 RIR, within 1 rep, of the RIR target that was provided throughout the intervention. So that's how I went about it. And, in practice, there's always going to be cases where individuals might overestimate or underestimate. And the beauty of my study was that I allowed that to happen. Set termination was completely on the participants' own volition. Sometimes they may have overestimated. There were a few occasions, although only a handful, where the RIR condition actually got to failure on like one of the sets. They just overestimated. And that happens in practice, right? And we're never going to be 100% accurate, and we're not going to really know that anyway. But the findings of my study show that if you can predict your RIR within 1 rep of the target, then RIR prescription is likely going to be an efficacious set termination strategy for you to promote muscle hypertrophy over time.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because in practice, everything we are programming, maybe it's like, oh, this is going to happen on the real world, right? And we assume that the client is going to do that. But sometimes when you see the videos, it's like, damn, you still have like 6, 7, or maybe more reps in reserve, right?
Yeah. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue with RIR prescription itself. At the end of the day, RIR prescription is just a tool. And as a coach, you have numerous tools that you can use, and how you use those tools is really important. So oftentimes, if a coach is complaining about the downsides of RIR prescription, it is likely due to their inability to coach it really, really well. There's always going to be some cases where participants, where individuals underestimate, clients underestimate, and you can troubleshoot that if you're on the gym floor working with them, or if you watch a video and you say, hey, here are a few tips, that you can employ next time you do this exercise to get closer to failure. You're always going to be able to troubleshoot that. But if that's happening on numerous occasions, then it's not necessarily an issue with the RIR prescription. It's an issue with how you're using it, how you're coaching it. So I think that's really important for people to understand, because personally, I don't use RIR prescription with everyone all the time. I use it with the individuals who I think it is suited towards. And in some cases, I'll try and build people up to that point, because I do think it can be a useful tool to employ at certain times, depending on obviously the goals of the individual.
So I think I'm gonna take this opportunity to make the another step. So what I use when they don't know how to estimate their RIR is like velocity loss. So I expect you to be a little uh, uh, more less speed, no?
Yeah. So the way
Less.
I would describe that to individuals who I've just started with, who might struggle to understand the concept, who I just don't think need to worry about for now, is basically I'll just instruct them that towards the end of their sets, the speed of the reps needs to be slowing down. So it's more of an intuitive approach to set termination. And this is such a great way to go about teaching someone how to train hard, because they can literally feel that in real time. They can feel the reps slowing down. They can watch videos of themselves and assess how they're training, and that can really help. And eventually you can combine that intuitive instruction with the numbers, with the RIR scale, if you think necessary. And just one more thing to add on top of that, it's often people think that RIR is used to pull training back and to help people train less hard. But in often cases, I actually find myself doing the opposite. So I usually use RIR to teach people how to train harder, because at the gym here, we get a lot of people who come in who are under the impression that they need to stop their sets at 8 reps or 10 reps or maybe 12, because they're even numbers and they sound quite good and they see them in magazines. But the reality is that based on the research we now have, it's likely that proximity to failure is more important than the certain number of reps you reach. So I use RIR to help people conceptualize the degrees of importance that we might have in a training program, right? So reps is here and RIR is up here. It's more important. So we need to prioritize this over the number of reps you're doing. If I write a rep range in a program, it's just a guide. And these are the cues that I'm giving individuals, and I teach them about RIR so that they can start prioritizing their proximity to failure, their RIR, over their reps, right? And by virtue of that, help them train harder. So I think that's an important consideration to put forth when we're speaking about how to coach RIR.
Yeah, personally, I don't train in odd numbers because it gives me bad luck and I lose my gains, and it's not good, man. It's not good. Not odd numbers for me.
Yeah.
Martin, one of the really interesting decisions in your study design, I think, is the within subject design. And I know it
Okay.
has its pros, it has its cons. I know you already got this question online. I think it's Instagram.
A lot of
What about
times.
the yeah the cross education phenomenon? But anyway, before that, I wanted to ask, what are the benefits of studying proximity to failure and hypertrophy in a within subject design?
Okay. Great question. So I've had that question many times, but I've only been able to respond, obviously, via, text. This is the first time I've answered it verbally. I think the unilateral design has many pros. I think the pros outweigh the cons when it comes to the unilateral study design. One of the first things to consider here is that when you do take the within subject or unilateral approach, you basically are automatically doubling your sample size, and that's something to really, I guess, hammer home here, because if I'm comparing my left to my right leg, right, I've got two separate data points. So I had 18 participants all up, right? But technically, I had 36 data points. So that allows for more statistical power. That's the first thing. If that's something that you want as part of your analysis, then that's a thumbs up. Now, moving on from that, the second advantage of using a within subject design is that it accounts for variables that might influence the outcomes we see. And these variables are very hard to account for with a between subject design. So for example, Daniel, if I had myself allocated to a failure group, right, and you were allocated to a non-failure group, and we both went through our protocols, who's to say that your genetics, your sleep, your nutrition, your stress levels, your recovery ability, who's to say that those variables aren't influencing the results that we're seeing? Right? You might have superior genetics to me. You might sleep better to me, sleep better than me. And some of these factors we just can't account for, right? Researchers don't often monitor people's sleep or monitor their nutrition perfectly or their stress levels, and there's nothing we can do about genetics. Now, the cool thing about a within subject design is that we're no longer comparing person to person. We're more so comparing, right, limb to limb within the same person, within the same individual. So if I compare my left leg to my right leg, that comparison in itself accounts for my genetics, my nutrition, sleep, stress, and all the other inherent factors that can influence the results. And I think that's such a massive advantage to the unilateral or the within subject study design. Now, when it comes to the downside, or at least the perceived downside, so the most common critique I've had or question I've had pertains to this cross-education effect. So people have asked, what you do to one limb, how you train one limb might influence the physiological response in the other. So isn't that a confounder, right, in this study? Wouldn't that confound the results? And my answer to that is not necessarily, because it depends on the outcomes you're assessing here. So what we know with confidence is that neuromuscular adaptations or neural adaptations do transfer from one limb to another, and that has been demonstrated multiple times, right? So training one limb whilst the other is immobilized may lead to a transfer of neural drive across the limbs, right? So the immobilized limb might actually get stronger. That's known as a cross-education effect. So there's a cross-education of neural adaptations. Now, what's been investigated less is cross-education of anabolic pathways or anabolic properties that might influence muscle hypertrophy. Now, the balance of the evidence shows that these hypertrophic pathways and properties that may lead to hypertrophy don't carry over as much from one limb to another. So hypertrophy and all the anabolism that takes place before it seems to be quite local. So often people will say, well, what about the systemic hormone release after a training session, right? If you train one limb, you're going to get the release of these anabolic hormones that may influence hypertrophy in the other limb. But we know that systemic hormone, circulation post-training isn't very well correlated with hypertrophy to begin with. There might also be an increase in myokines, which are immune cells that are upregulated after training, which may play some role in hypertrophy, which are released into the circulation that might travel over to the other limb, but even that doesn't seem to influence hypertrophy to a great degree. So right now, what we know based on the research is that using a within subject design when looking at hypertrophy is likely a reliable approach because there seems to be little to no cross-education. And if we were doing it, though, for strength-related outcomes, we're probably going to be subject to that limitation of cross-education. But when it comes to muscle hypertrophy, it seems to be a very robust study design. And something to keep in mind is that a lot of the research in this area is done on untrained individuals, where we see that the cross-education effect. So if there is some cross-education, I think it would be less so, even more Yeah, less so in a resistance trained population.
And also between subjects, I think one of the also interesting considerations that you took, it's both the nutritional aspect and also the menstrual cycle consideration. So it's really nice to see all this literature come together in a big study like this and get these results and get to understand better how all of this, let's say, converges and how it affects the other thing, but not in a
Yep.
way that one would think, right?
Yep. True. True.
I'm leaving my man Juan to take the microphone now.
Okay.
I'm gonna be
Uh,
silent.
so something I got in mind, it's like in your study, the participants just I didn't get that clear from the text. The participant just assist to the lab 2 days per week, or they went 4 days per week for each leg, or they have like a rest interval between one leg and the other leg.
Mm. So it was they trained twice per week. There were 2 sessions per week, and in each session, both legs were trained,
Okay.
but one leg was trained before the other. So we finished the protocol on one leg, had a rest, and then started the protocol and
Mhm.
finished it on the opposing leg. And then in each of the sessions, the starting leg was alternated. So each leg had a chance to start fresh.
Yeah. Okay. So I did have another question. So we actually talk a little about it. This is about volume. So first, I think context is important here. So volume on tonnage or in kilograms per volume total set or total session, it's important, but when it's standardized, right? When it's under the same conditions, the same tempo, etc., etc. So we have this like assumption or this little part of the text that you say, uh, maybe volume it's more important than proximity to failure per se on the results of the study, and that caught my attention because I know about 2 studies, just 2 studies, the Sousa and Sousa juniors, and they made some studies about interval rest, and they in both studies they have 2 groups. One group with constant rest interval 2 minutes, and the other one was 2 minutes, and they decreased the interval rest about 3 week and
Mm.
go until 8 week.
I
So they
think, sorry to interrupt, I think
yeah
it was a rest interval decreased by 15 seconds each
yeah
session, something like that, right?
that's right.
Yeah.
15 seconds every week, right? So the groups that they have on decreased interval resting, they have or similar results or greater results, and even they have just less total volume. I don't know if this may be because the repetition wasn't standardized, right? And they maybe were too close to failure, and if we get that like very close to failure is important. I don't know if you have any perspective here.
Yeah, I actually want to ask for your perspectives because it sounds like you know that literature quite well. I'm not overly familiar with the literature on rest periods, and I'm really big on methods. So if I don't understand the methods of a study very well
Yeah.
and I haven't read them, I'm reluctant to speak confidently about the study findings because, like you just mentioned, even the smallest aspect of the methodological approach can influence the findings of the study. So if you read through my paper, the methods there's got to be like 2,000 to 3,000 words just in the methods because
Yeah.
I love methods. So I'd love to hear your perspective on it a little bit more. I haven't thought about it enough to really have, a confident opinion there. I guess at the end of the day, it's only 2 studies
Yeah.
that show that. But yeah, I'd love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, so my mind was like the groups first proximity to failure, no, right? The failure wasn't like this definition, so they
Mm.
trained 8 to 12 RM. So maybe they didn't reach failure, or they don't know how proximity to failure they were, right? So maybe I think that it's a limitation of the study. The other one is, I don't know how standardized was the repetitions. I know they went to the lab 3 times per week. I know they make a protocol of bench press and squat.
Yeah.
But the part of how proximity to failure is the definition isn't clear. So maybe that's the gap I see there. No? And it's what caught my attention is that they had greater results and they measure about MRI. So it's a really
Yeah.
good procedure to take the measures, right?
Yeah.
In both studies. So I don't know how deep I can go in here because I'm not a statistician
Yeah.
expert, right? But those was my perspective.
Yeah. I think we always have to think about how this might apply practically. So what I mean by that is if a study is assessing the effect of rest periods on hypertrophy, but they only have one exercise for that muscle in a training program. So let's say it's like bicep curls or just leg extensions, and they're looking at the quads, and they might be doing 3 or 4 sets. I think if they're just employing one exercise, I'm not sure if a shorter rest period is going to have that much of an effect on the outcomes.
Okay.
Now, Daniel, do you ever just do, one exercise for a muscle group in a program? Probably not. I watch your training, online, and it doesn't seem like you do that.
And
If you're
let me
doing a
tell
full body,
and let me
sorry?
tell you, man, that gets me a little bit nervous because oh man, Martin is watching. I better not fuck up, man.
I was watching you do side raises this morning.
Yeah,
And then
man.
I was watching you pose, and I'm like, this
Ah,
guy needs
yes,
some posing lessons.
Jesus Christ, man. Yeah, I need posing lessons
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
anyway, man, go ahead, please go
Yeah.
ahead.
So what I'm saying is, in practice, I think the effect of rest periods on the long-term outcome is probably dependent on like how many exercises and sets you're doing for a muscle group within a training session. If you're just doing one exercise and you've got 3 or 4 sets, I don't think a short rest period is really going to be that detrimental long term. But most people train with multiple exercises
Yeah.
and multiple sets for a muscle group in a session. So Daniel, you might be doing, if you're doing an upper body workout, you might have 8, 9, 10 sets for chest in that workout. And I think if you look at the aggregate effect of rest periods across a whole workout, shorter rest periods may have a larger effect on the outcomes if you're doing more exercises. So what I'm saying is, I don't exactly know how these studies are set up, and I don't know how many exercises or sets they were performing for the target muscle, but that's something to keep in mind and something that I use, in practice when I'm coaching rest periods. Like, if a client has 3 sets of side raises at the end of their program and that's all they're doing for their shoulders on that day for whatever reason, say, hey, maybe you don't need to rest that long, 1 to 2 minutes, that's it. Whereas if they have 8 to 10 sets of like back in their program or chest or whatever it is, or even legs, I'll tell them to rest a little bit longer because I think the aggregate effect might be more important long term.
Man, I'm speaking of methods. So you confirmed, Martin, prior that if you were an actor, you were a method actor, right? Like let's say Heath Ledger and those guys that really got into character. That would be you if you were an actor, right, man? The
Yeah,
thing I wanted
that's
to
me.
ask you about your methods, it's precisely exercise selection because it's obviously lower body, about the leg press and the leg extension that you
Mhm.
choose. Why those exercises? And maybe it was a practical thing, perhaps. And do you think the differences would be really important if we were to talk about the upper body? And what was your
Uh,
train of thought to select those exercises?
yeah, mostly practical. For a few reasons. I think they're common exercises that people employ in the gym. We have access in my lab, my gym. I have access to that equipment. I can easily use a velocity tracker on the leg press to assess changes in lifting velocity. And both exercises are very stable, which allows individuals to train close to failure reliably, across sets. If I was doing something like a dumbbell split squat, it'd be much harder to run this study design. So most of the considerations were practical. Something to keep in mind there, which we may talk about if we have time, regarding the results, is that the leg press seems to work the
Yeah.
VL more it does the rec fem, leg extension, vice versa, rec fem over VL, and that may have influenced some of our muscle-specific findings. Now, when it comes to the upper body, I don't know. I don't think muscles respond that differentially. Across the body, I think they respond in a pretty similar manner. Of course, I'd love to see more research. I'd love to see my study design replicated in the upper body. It's just a little bit harder to do. And what I mean by that is if I've got my participants just doing quad training isn't really influenced by many other muscles. The only one I can really think of right now is like the glutes. And really, besides that, it's like there's no real additional influence of other musculature. So if I was doing bicep curls, for example, and I was measuring growth in the biceps, I'd have to control for all the back exercises that my clients
Yeah.
are doing, or my participants, are doing, right? I'm a coach and researcher, sometimes I say clients, sometimes I say participants. I'd have to control for that. Whereas because I'm just measuring changes in quadriceps thickness, my participants were able to do any other training that they wanted to do with some restraints, but they were able to train their upper body just fine. They could train their hamstrings. They could do a little bit of glute training because all that additional training is unlikely to affect any changes we see in the quads. Whereas again, if I was testing biceps, I'd have to control for a lot of other variables within their training, which just makes it hard to recruit participants because let's face it, participants don't want to change their whole training routine for a study, especially if they're resistance trained. So it's something to keep in mind there.
Yeah, totally. One of the things, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the usual keyboard warrior type comment on studies training to failure is, oh, they don't really train that hard. But you actually included footage, video footage, right, of the people training. So I think that's
Yeah.
a really, really novel thing that I heard. I think it was Jeff Nippert propose, and you actually carried out, man. I thought that was super cool and super helpful because science, it's a little more accessible and more in the language of nowadays, right? Instead of just text.
Yeah, we're trying to be transparent about the procedures. I mean, I couldn't record every set. Running research is hard. I just to give some perspective, I took all the sessions, like literally every single session. There's about 400 sessions across the 10 weeks. And I had to watch all the sets. I had to count all the reps. I had to time all the rest periods. I had to do everything, and I tried my best to film a few sets. So I have sample set termination footage online, which you can check out, which I hope, researchers can continue to do. That's the first time it's ever been done,
Yeah.
to my knowledge, anyway, in exercise science, and hopefully that helps deter some of those comments, right?
Real man. So Juan, if you have any questions about the study design, go ahead. But if not, I think we can dig into the results actually. But honestly, man, to be completely honest with you, Martin, I thought the study design and all the things you had to think about are even more interesting than the results on itself, man. But that's just me, man.
The
So
methods,
so
right? The methods, yeah.
you're a crazy
Yeah.
man. You work really hard, man.
No, I think we can go to the findings because it's awesome.
Okay, hit
So
me.
you haven't. Okay, so actually, you given us a little about it. So, but about hypertrophy, the order seems to matter, right? So the hypertrophy results, it's like important the proximity to failure about how rectus femoris respond. Right? If you are reaching failure on 3 sets versus if you're letting one on
Mhm.
no two reps in reserve, right? So
Yeah.
what do you think these findings are? So I know that
Yeah,
it's on the text, but just
yeah. So overall, we use the Bayesian approach to statistical analysis. So we weren't looking for statistically significant differences, right? So that's the first thing that people have to kind of bypass because it's common to just look for a p-value.
Yeah.
Because most studies report p-values, so it's common for people to think they have to listen out for a p-value.
Hmm.
But we're not talking about p-values here. We're talking more so about probabilities. So
Hmm.
with Bayesian analysis, we're estimating the size of certain effects, their probability, and also their uncertainty, and then making comparisons. And I think it's a more intuitive way to understand findings. The main finding was that muscle hypertrophy, overall quadriceps hypertrophy, right, when accounting for the rec fem and the VL, seem to be similar across the protocol. So the
Hmm.
probability distributions, right? And what I'm talking about here is the probability of observing a certain outcome and how that looks as a distribution for each of the protocols. It looked very similar. And when we compared those distributions and we assessed the probability of the outcomes either favoring RIR or fail, it
Hmm.
was very even.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like the flip of a coin. It's like basically like 50-50, right? That's what the outcomes look like overall. But what we did is we conducted further analyses because I assessed both the VL and the RF. And what we found there was some divergent results. It's important to understand that the differences I'm about to speak about, they're quite small in nature, and they could be due to measurement error. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, what I did, which I also think is somewhat novel or significant at least, is I conducted 2 ultrasound assessments before the intervention started and 2 afterwards as well,
Hmm.
right? Then I worked out the error margin of my own ultrasound assessments. That error margin was quite small. So if if a difference doesn't exceed that error margin,
Yep.
we can't confidently say that it's a difference we should actually be, putting all our attention towards.
Yep.
And in the case of the rec fem and the VL, what we found was that for the VL, the vastus lateralis, training to failure seemed to promote slightly greater a slightly greater change in quadriceps thickness. For the rec fem, the RIR protocol seemed to induce slightly greater changes in quadriceps thickness. Now, whether or not that is due to hypertrophy or minor measurement error, it's hard to say
Okay.
because the differences were quite small. But nonetheless, these differences were there, right? And they were like directional, so
Hmm.
you can see that in the graphs.
Yep.
And when you look at the repetition volume that the protocols accumulated, and like the volume load, and you look at some of these other variables that we assessed as well, what we see is that training to failure, because the leg press was the first exercise, it allowed for more volume, right, on that first exercise.
Hmm.
Right, leg press was always the first one, but then on the leg extension, which is always the second exercise, the
Hmm.
RIR protocol seemed to accumulate more rep volume. So there seemed to be like this opposing effect based on exercise order. Right, it's likely the failed protocol went into the leg extension a little more fatigued than the RIR protocol. So maybe that's what is leading to some of these minor changes we're seeing in muscle specific, hypertrophy. So the hypothesis there was that, hey, maybe going to leg press because it's your first exercise, maybe going to failure on the leg press maximizes hypertrophy of the target musculature, which is the VL, right? But then may compromise you on subsequent exercises. Whereas if you're trained to RIR, you might get more hypertrophy out of subsequent exercises because you're going into them a little bit more fresh, a little more recovered. That was the hypothesis that we described in the manuscript, in the paper, but we obviously need more research in that area to come to clear conclusions. And for now, all we need to do is consider exercise order and carry over fatigue in our programming.
Because also in regards to your findings, Martin, one of the also interesting things is that the failure condition decreased more repetitions
Yep.
all through the sets. So the typical rationale in defense of training to failure is that you get your tissue exposed to more mechanical tension, right? But in reality, because you are more fatigued set to set to set, you actually complete less repetitions and you get exposed to less mechanical tension, right? So is this what are we seeing in your results also?
Yeah, well, that's the initial thought, and then the rebuttal to that would be that over time you become fatigue resistant, and that you experience less repetition loss when you train to failure, right? That's what people often say as well. And that's definitely the case. Like fatigue resistance seems to be a thing. I've definitely noticed it in some of my clients. And what I did in this study was I actually assessed proxies of fatigue across the whole intervention period. And what we found was that on the leg extension specifically, repetition loss from the first to the final set actually decreased for both the protocols across the intervention. So they actually got less fatigue. They lost less reps across the whole protocol. But throughout all the sessions, failure still lost more than RIR. So RIR always lost less, but they both improved. On the leg press, however, we didn't really see that effect. They both actually decreased. They both actually increased slightly their repetition loss, RIR more so. So basically what I'm saying here is that there seems to be some fatigue resistance, right, that takes place across a training intervention. This is one of the first times longitudinal fatigue has actually been assessed in an intervention looking at hypertrophy. It's quite scarce in the literature. And on some exercises, your repetition loss over time might improve. You might become more resistant to fatigue. I think that's more so the case on exercises where the mechanisms of fatigue are a little more isolated. What I mean by this is on the leg extension, really, you're just suffering from metabolic fatigue, right? So how fast can your muscles remove metabolic byproducts and replenish themselves in between the rest periods? That's fatigue on like a leg extension. Whereas with a leg press, there's other things that come into play. There's the cardiovascular demand, right? You kind of got to coordinate yourself a little bit more. There's other muscles working too. So the resistance to fatigue might not improve to the same extent as something like a leg extension, something to keep in mind. And I think in practice, it really always comes down to what you're observing in front of you as a coach. If over time you have clients who are really becoming fatigue resistant, right, and you can see that they're not losing that many repetitions across sets, you can push them a bit closer to failure. And we also have to keep in mind that in practice, we can adjust our rest periods. Like there's no one standing by us saying, hey, in 3 minutes you have to go, in 4 minutes you have to go again. Whereas in my study, it was always a 4-minute rest period. So in practice, we have a little bit more flexibility. And as a coach, we have to use what we're seeing in front of us to make decisions. And we can adjust those decisions on the fly. So if someone is losing a lot of reps, we can possibly rest longer to try and buffer that, or we can pull their proximity to failure back. There's different ways you can go about it. I don't think there is a right or a wrong way. It's always dependent on the client who's in front of you and the goals that they have, long term. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, totally, man. I just to add a little bit about neuromuscular fatigue. There's, I think it's a narrative that fatigue is something to be avoided, but not really, right? Maybe in a gym setting, do you think fatigue can be useful, maybe as a proxy that we are actually training hard enough?
Yeah, I think it also depends on the goals. If we're talking about hypertrophy, if the context
Yeah,
is hypertrophy, fatigue is less so an issue, right? If we're speaking about strength or power or any other athletic endeavor whereby fatigue can really hinder your output and your performance quality, I think you have to consider it. So the principle of fatigue management is a broad principle that needs to be applied differently depending on the goals. Like I said, when we're looking at muscle hypertrophy, fatigue seems to be less of an issue because what is going to promote hypertrophy, the stimulus that will promote hypertrophy will also cause fatigue. So it's just something to consider within your program design. I think it's good practice to try and limit excessive fatigue. Right, you don't want to be excessively fatigued. I've had many clients who've come to me who've been excessively fatigued from training 6 days a week, twice a day, doing this, doing that, and we pull them back, and they're arguably experiencing less fatigue, right, but experiencing better results. Now, I don't exactly know if that's due to the training stimulus changing, or maybe we're improving their nutrition, their sleep, and a few other things as well. But it's just something to keep in mind, right? Your body doesn't differentiate stress very well. It just pulls stress into the system, and stress can have detrimental effects, but it's also important for adaptation. So it's a matter of just considering that in your programming, right? It's not a matter of trying to avoid it. It's just trying to avoid its excessive buildup, right, to a point where it may be detrimental to your overall performance or your ability to actually get through a session. etc. And this is going to be individual. This is going to change from person to person. I have some females who they're like machines. They just train and they never get fatigued, or at least it doesn't look like that. So I'm obviously going to be pushing them harder than someone else who may not respond like that. So I agree. It's not something that should be avoided. I think it should be welcomed, right? But I also think we need to consider it in our overall program design.
It must be, it must be well managed, right?
Correct.
One. Yeah.
So Juan, I
Yeah.
don't know if you have another question.
Yeah. Just one more. So I seen some influencers or people on social media that
I hope you're
use
not talking about me and my shitty posting, man, because I'm gonna take it personally.
ever. Yeah. Just I think this may be because this is the first direct evidence about the subject. So it's like you need to push this hard to make results. So in my opinion, maybe this is not the case. This is like if you push this harder, you will get results. But maybe, on my perspective, you don't need to push that hard every time on every muscle group. So my question here is maybe there's some muscle groups or exercises or maybe some volume related variables that must be considered when prescribing RIR.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and speak to you guys through a framework that I use to make these decisions, because I think some people seem to be under the impression that as somebody who uses research to make decisions, some people seem to be under the impression that, as I'm writing up a program for a client, I have all these research papers piled up next to me that I'm looking at and that I'm reading whilst I make these decisions. That's not the case. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build a bridge between research and practice, and you need more than just research to do that. So I have a framework in place that allows me to make these decisions, and it's got 3 different layers to it. So the first layer is the most basic one. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to use heuristics to figure out how close to failure an exercise should be pushed. And I'm not really using research to create these heuristics, because there simply is no research that will tell you, for example, that you should probably push closer to failure if the target muscle on that exercise is the limiting factor. We don't really have any research to suggest that. But what I think, because I have certain reasons to think this way, I think that if you're doing an exercise, you're completing an exercise where the target muscle is the limiting factor, it's the only one, you should probably push that one closer to failure, right? That's just a logical heuristic that I try and employ. Another one could be the stability demand of the exercise. There's no research that is going to tell us a more stable exercise should be pushed closer to failure. But again, it's a heuristic I employ. If I'm programming an exercise that is unstable, I'm not going to tell someone to push to failure. So it's a heuristic. What about the systemic fatigue, right? And the acute fatigue cost, right? So I've got these heuristics that I use to try and conceptualize how close to failure a certain exercise should be pushed, right? Based on the stability demands, the limiting factor, the systemic fatigue cost, and the acute fatigue cost. And those are things that I consider, right? And other coaches might consider other things, right? I'm just speaking through the framework that I employ here. That's the first layer. Now, we can't just look at that layer. We also have to look at the second one, which brings into play the other training variables in the program, right? So this is now where we can reach for some research and use the research to inform our decisions, because we have research on volume and frequency and load. We have research that we should probably use to just guide our decision making here, right? So once I have all these exercises set and I have a rough idea of how close to failure I want to be pushing these exercises based on the features that I mentioned earlier, then I'm going to look at the total design of the program. How much volume am I doing for each muscle group, right? How often is this person training? What loads are they lifting? Are they heavy or are they light, right? How are their exercises ordered? This is where I then move the needle a little bit on some of those exercises, right? So if, for example, the set volume is really high for this client's chest because we're trying to build the chest, right? I might have to consider that and move the needle further from failure, possibly on those chest-related exercises, because we have a lot of volume, right? That's just an example. There's different ways we can apply that. Okay, if the client is lifting lower loads, right, lighter loads, I'm going to move the needle the other way. I'm going to push those exercises closer to failure, right? So that needle, right, on the continuum is being adjusted, not just based on those heuristics, but now also based on the other training variables. And then the third layer, one of the more important ones, is considering the individual characteristics. And hopefully this highlights to people how complicated, coaching can actually be. But if you have frameworks in place, it makes these decisions so much easier to make. For me, these decisions are easy to make when I sit down and write a program because I have a framework in place, right? So when we're looking at individual characteristics, then we're pulling at our knowledge of physiology, right? And hard science. So how fatigable is somebody, right? How well do they recover? What's their nutrition status like? Are they in a surplus or are they in a deficit? Because we have some reason to believe that nutrition status will affect your recovery, right? How well are you sleeping? What's your stress levels at, right? What are your stress levels at? These are some things we can't quantify, but we can have a rough understanding about. Even perceptual responses, right? And some individuals may also play sport. So you have to consider that too. So the third layer is individual characteristics. And I'm using that last layer to fine tune the rest of the program. And that's how I decide, right, how close certain exercises should be pushed to failure. In some instances, exercise will be pushed very close to failure, others not so much. And that can vary across a whole session, depending on all those factors. And that might sound quite complicated, but complicated thinking gets easier over time, right? Initially, when I didn't have these frameworks in place, it was a little harder for me to make these decisions. But now that I have a framework in place, I have my first layer, which is built on heuristics. I have my second layer, which is built on training variables, right, and empirical research. And my third layer, which is built on individual characteristics and my understanding of physiology, right, and hard science. I can use all of that to make educated decisions that I think help bridge the gap between research and practice. And it's not just a matter of using research, it's zooming out and using research along with, a more global understanding of science. Right? I think oftentimes people use the word science and research synonymously, but from my perspective, they're a bit different. So thinking logically and coherently and using our understanding of physiology is also science, even if it isn't coming directly from a research paper. And that's how I build my bridge between research and practice. So hopefully, even if there's coaches listening to this, they can take that and build their own frameworks for decision making.
That was
I think that's
beautiful, man. Let me tell
yeah.
you. And you actually
It was.
described the figure 7 on your recently published paper. All
That's
this continuum
basically it, right?
Yeah.
yeah, and it's super helpful because you speak about different populations. You speak about bodybuilders, sport athletes, general population.
Yeah.
And I think I heard it from Eric Holmes that training to failure is pretty much just a foolproof method of training. It's okay, but it's just so short-sighted that doesn't take into account all that you mentioned that actually can be, let's say, simplified, not simple, but yes, simplified,
Yeah.
and better yield results, man. So anyway, I don't want to take any more of your time. Just as a final note, I wanted to ask, what are your future steps in the research? Because I think this was a big one. So
Yeah.
congratulations on that one.
Thank you.
Congratulations, soon to be Dr. Refalo. So
Very
anyway,
soon, yeah, hopefully.
of course, my man. What are you planning ahead after this study?
Yeah,
What would you
well,
like to research now?
yeah, well, I don't want to run any experimental studies because it's just a big time commitment that I want to step away from for a while. But I'm still going to be involved in research, behind the scenes. So, for example, I'm currently in the process of collaborating with Brad Schoenfeld on a rest periods meta-analysis. So, Yuan, if you ask me that question again in a couple months' time, I might have a better answer for you because I'm going to have to read all that literature. Yeah, I'm going to be running a sex differences analysis on this training study. So remember, everything we're speaking about today, some of the things at least, could be influenced by sex because I had both males and females within the study, right? So I'm going to be running sex difference analysis, which is going to form another paper. I also assessed perceptual responses, so perceived discomfort, exertion, general feelings, which are going to form a third paper. So there's more research on this study that will come as the year goes by. I'm also in the process of publishing a scoping review with a few other guys on sex differences in neuromuscular fatigue. And I also have a meta-analysis looking at sex differences in muscle hypertrophy, which is hopefully going to be published in the coming weeks. So I expect you guys to send me another message when that one is published,
You
and we
can
can have
count on
another
that
chat
one. And
about a
sorry
different
in
topic
advance, man.
because I have many interests, and I want to speak about something else next time.
Yeah, you know what happens?
Yeah.
Let's say with Max Coleman, he's known. We joked about it about he's the deload guy. With Milo Wolf, he's the partials guy, and you're the failure guy. So I know I understand that you have a lot of other things that you want to talk about. So I would be
Yeah.
more than delighted to. So Juan, I don't know if you want to add anything about.
No, right. Actually, thank you. Thank you very much. Congratulations for your PhD. So, and hopefully we can follow your work, no? Because I think it's unfortunate that here in Mexico we don't have that level of
Mm,
studies on exercise science, but hope
mhm.
someday and we can participate in something in the future. So, but thank you for this exclusive and just have a good afternoon because I think theirs is like 2 p.m., right?
Yeah, I won't be having a good afternoon. I'm about to train legs, so
Yeah.
it's going to be a pretty bad afternoon actually.
Man, I gotta insist. When I see that you saw my stories, I also have Zach Robinson. Sometimes I have Hales. Man, I get nervous as fuck. I'm like, I better not fuck around. So you guys make me train harder. So,
It's
so
that
thanks,
Yeah, man.
sexual.
that's interesting.
Don't
It's
overthink it,
interesting
man.
always.
Yeah. And I appreciate those words, and yeah, love to catch up again in the near future.
Thanks a lot, my man. Hope you have
Thanks,
a great
man.
rest of the day, Martin, and hope to
No
see you
worries.
soon again.
Thank you,
See ya.
Have a
guys.